Hey everybody, this is Carter and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, my little fancy little podcast where I interview other writers. And for those of you who are just kind of joining the show, I seem to have been getting some new subscribers lately. We tend to focus on the writer's journey on the show. We rarely talk about the contents of any particular work of the authors, and that's mostly because I don't have time to read all of those books. But it's an improvisational show. I don't prepare any questions in advance, but I'm very focused on the author's journey. How did you write that first book? What were your influences? What is your writing style? What do you think about as you're sitting down to write? I just love all that stuff. And, we talk about the writer's psychology quite a bit, which I also enjoy. And before we get to today's guest, just to note that my new book, Tell Me What You Did, is out. It's a Barnes & Noble monthly pick in the mystery suspense category. So if this will probably be out in March. So that book will be in and out of the Barnes & Noble stores, at least in terms of being in the front there, but it'll still be in the stores. You can check it out and head on over to my website, carterwilson.com. You can check out my event calendar to see if I'm touring anywhere near you. You can subscribe to my newsletter, all that good stuff. And I also have a company called Unbound Writer. So that's Unbound Writer. It's really geared towards helping writers become authors. I do one-on-one coaching, and I can do free consultations to see if we're a good fit. I have self-guided online classes. I have seminars and workshops and retreats, and we do have retreats coming up in the later spring, so make sure you check that out as well. All right, without further ado, let's talk about today's guest. So today I had on the show my friend, Andrew DeYoung. And I know Andrew because we have the same publisher, Poison Pen Press, which is the mystery suspense thriller imprint of Source Books. And Andrew's first book with Poison Pen Press came out in 2024, titled The Day He Never Came Home, which did really well, got great reviews, and he's following that up with the title, This Summer, Stay Away From Him. So please make sure to check those out. But he did have books out before that with different publishers of varying sizes. But we talked at length about Source Books and just kind of our opinions on how great they are and how well that they treat us. And we talked a lot about just, if you're an aspiring writer and you're sitting there listening to this and you are trying to figure out work-life writing balance, this is a good episode for you because we went into that a lot. In fact, the interview took place from a break room at his corporate job, and he actually works in publishing. So he was on his lunch break when we did this interview, and Andrew has figured out how to juggle those things, little kids at home, that kind of a thing, and he's figured out how to write a book fairly quickly, but also write a book that doesn't feel forced, that feels meaningful to him, that he's not just trying to achieve 2,000 words a day in order to make a quota. So there's lots of good advice to this episode. And at the end, we make up an X-Files adjacent story from a sentence from Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. So you want to make sure to make it all the way through the episode to get to that little tasty treat there. All right, you're going to like this, friends. This is my interview with Andrew DeYoung.
I'm calling in from an undisclosed location.
Smart.
I'm calling you over a lunch break for my work. So this is an inside look at the life of a writer.
Yes.
Who, as you know, many of us have other gigs aside from writing, shockingly.
Yes. And it's, it's funny. So you and I were both at Josh Molling's launch event just last week. Happened to be in Minnesota, which is where you live. And he was talking about having recently become a full-time writer. And all of us writers know what that means in our head. Like, oh, you must be married. Because I honestly have no idea, but I know that it's terribly difficult to make enough money to support not only yourself, but potentially a family, a partner, whatever. So we do have to do all those different, and I used to do the same thing, and now I'm just trying to figure it out, but it's hustling, man.
Yeah, there were a lot of writers in the room at that event, and when Josh said that he had quit his day job to focus on writing full time, I could feel the envy
Yeah.
among many of us.
Yeah.
Like, ooh, I would really love that.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I don't know how I want to put this. Writing, you think you get published, or I think the perception is you get published. It's like, oh, so this is who you are now.
Hmm.
And you're like, well, you don't realize how many books get published and how hard it is to get in front of people. And you could be with a huge publisher like we both are with Source Books, Poison Pen
Yep.
Press, and that doesn't guarantee anything. So and you might even have a great year, but
Yeah,
that's
for
not,
sure.
next year it's like, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to give you a 3% inflation bump. Like, no, it doesn't. And health insurance and all that stuff. So I didn't mean to start this by just bashing on how hard it is to make money as a writer, but
Well,
figured,
I started it by calling in from like a meeting room, obviously at an office with like, drop ceilings and everything like
all
that.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, have you always lived in Minnesota?
Lived in Minnesota, lived in the Midwest essentially for most of my life.
Okay.
Michigan, Iowa, and then Minnesota for at least 20 years now. So
Okay.
yeah, good long time.
Okay. And as a kid, were you a creative kid? Were you wanting to, like, I'm going to be an English major?
I was a bookish kid, and
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely had dreams of being a writer. I don't think that I had sort of fears of pursuing it too much or being too loud about the fact that I was pursuing it or wanted to pursue it because I was afraid of being bad at it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you're bad at something that you are that interested in, it doesn't feel very good to be revealed to be bad. So I think for a long time I was afraid of saying out loud to anybody that I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah. That's
Um,
let's
yeah.
break that down for a second because that's super interesting. And I've never heard anyone put it quite like that. The idea of you don't want to vocalize that or you don't want to realize that you're bad at something you love.
Hmm.
And that encapsulates it so well because in a lot of my coaching, I talk about obviously the imposter syndrome and not
Yep.
even like I'm scared to say I want to write. You could have 5 books and you're still afraid to tell people you're a writer because you're like, I don't
Yes.
belong here. That's great. You had these books out. Yeah, but they didn't sell very well. Like you were always trying to diminish ourselves. And
Hmm.
it's a very interesting thing. And I don't quite know why that is, but it's terribly hard for a writer to. That's why we all struggle a lot of times with social media, like paying, calling attention to ourselves. It's just, but you have to do that kind of thing, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's protective, at least initially. You don't want to be bad at it. I think that, and there might be a notion that people who are creatives are just naturally good at it right away.
Right.
Like the sort of the idea of the genius, and there might be a few people who like their first book is just amazing or whatever. The irony is that you have to be bad for a little while.
Totally.
At least most people have to be bad.
Right.
So, um, but the thing is that I, for a time, sort of prevented myself from even writing because I felt like I was bad at it. And
Yeah.
it was so painful to be bad at something that I wanted to do so badly.
Right.
Ultimately, it was the willingness to be bad for a little while that cracked things open for me.
Yeah, and there's so much to talk about here. There's so much about it that people ascribe to as talent, which I think talent does play a role. But it's
Mhm.
not like, for example, you've always wanted to be an NFL player and you just literally don't have the physical abilities to do that.
Right.
I feel like with writing, there is talent involved, but so much of it not only is the consistency of failing and trying and being vulnerable to learning, but also through those hundreds of thousands of words of failing, finding your voice, which I don't think comes out for a long, long, long time. For
Wow.
me, I can look back in my fifth published book, which was my eighth written book. I think that's where I found my voice.
Interesting.
So it takes a lot. But how do you know how do you know that line of demarcation, which is very fuzzy and blurry, of where you get to the point you're like, oh, okay, I'm good at this, or does that ever come?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I should ask you because you're so many books ahead of me. Um, I sometimes I'm not sure if I'm even there yet.
Yeah,
Obviously, you look at work that you've done in the past and you think, well, that wasn't quite there yet. I hadn't quite discovered my voice. I'm doing better work now. Sometimes I still wonder, how am I going to look back on the work that I'm doing right now,
right.
10 years from now? Will
Yeah,
I
you
actually, in
just don't
hindsight,
is the
say,
answer.
I still hadn't cracked it. I thought that I'd cracked it, but I hadn't.
Yeah,
It's an interesting question. And I guess, at a certain point, you've got books out there. You have to be a little bit forgiving for with yourself a
totally.
little bit. There's no other way to do it.
No, you're 100% right. And I remember when I wrote my first book, having zero business writing in anything and having zero training and being quite assured that it was terrible. I began the agent hunt. And
Hmm.
and I remember thinking to myself, I don't want to self-publish because how else am I going to know if this is any good? I
Hmm.
needed that third-party vested interest. But even when that comes, and even when then you actually sell it to a publisher, it's not like, all right, I'm good. It's
Yeah,
like,
that's right.
oh, thank God somebody believed my lies.
I got one person to believe it. And,
Right.
a thing that a writer can do to themselves, I think it's very individual, like
Yeah.
what a particular person's neuroses is. But I've struggled sometimes, like, oh, I've convinced one or two people, I've convinced an agent and an editor that I'm good. And then the reviews start coming in, and some of them are good and some of them are bad.
Yeah.
And a writer can really get in a weird cycle where they give the bad feedback a little bit more credit. Like they have found
Totally.
out the truth. Everybody who I've fooled in the 4 and 5 star reviews, they have been fooled. But like this person who gave me 2 stars, they know the truth.
Right. That's
But
so
yeah,
true.
eventually you have to find your own level of confidence, I think.
You do. And that's the irony of writing, I think, is because so much of it does hinge on confidence because confidence begets all these other important things like trusting your instincts, trusting where the story's going, even if you haven't figured it out yet. That if you don't have that, it's easy to fail, but it's terrifically hard to have that because it's a world just immersed in rejection and critical reviews, to your point, and kind of this weird shame. And I
Mhm.
and I do think there's this like these roots of like, why should I be spending time on something I love? I should be working hard. I should be in my cubicle, and this isn't making much money and it's my passion. And it's so easy to diminish it in your mind as a hobby almost, even if you're totally published. And it's weird. And it takes a while to overcome that and say, like, I am a writer. This is what I do. And sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's amazing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I feel like you're kind of having a breakthrough maybe right now. I hope that you feel pretty confident given that people are just receiving tell me what you did so positively.
Thanks.
Um,
I
I
am, but
mean,
I'll tell you the double edged sword of that because
yeah.
the writer's
What do you do
brain
next?
is like, right. It's like, I don't know why this book is
Sure.
catching. I don't know why. And I look at it, I'm like, I like it, but there are other books that I love that I wrote that didn't do great.
Hmm.
So, feeling ignorant about the reasons
Yep.
and then feeling like, oh, this is just a one off weird thing.
The fluke. Yeah.
Totally. But I study meditation a lot and manifestation. And I'm like, just enjoy the moment,
Sure.
contribute what you can to it. And what happens after that. So, but I do find it's funny. I have something else written that no one has seen yet. And then I'm starting on something new and I have an idea. And all of a sudden in my mind, I'm like, is this propulsive? Like, tell me what you did. Is this idea?
Sure.
And you immediately start doubting, and like, don't try to replicate because that doesn't work even if you
No, it
replicated it
doesn't.
perfectly. So what did you study going off to school?
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately I did study, I was an English major.
Okay.
And I think finally I named the writing goal sometime in high school. I was
Oh,
actually
that's great.
there was a particular teacher I had who for whatever reason her assignment to us was to put on paper the like one thing in life that we wanted to do. And
Mm.
people were like, I want to play Major League Baseball,
It's all
like high
sports,
school kids.
sports
We
and
were putting all our
veterinarians.
dreams out there. Yeah. And I said I want to be a published novelist. And so that was my first time of like really, really saying it out loud. Ultimately went to school to be an English major. Even got my master's in English, thinking that I was going to be a professor. Turns out, academia is like really hard and getting harder. There's a lot of PhDs out there, a
Mhm.
lot of people working adjunct jobs, God bless them. But I didn't land in academia. But I did exit grad school with a unpublishable novel manuscript.
Was that novel
Literary,
part of a?
realistic fiction. Go ahead.
I was
Sorry.
just saying, was that part of a thesis that you were doing, part of a class?
Yeah, I did like an independent study kind of thing. And it was sort of like a fiction writing thing with a published novelist on staff. Not anyone who's particularly well known, but one of these academics who also does a lot of fiction writing, who just took me under their wing and kind of shepherded me through a manuscript. And
Hmm.
I don't even know if I could find that one anymore. When I count, sometimes people ask me how many manuscripts I've written versus
Right.
how many are published. Sometimes I don't even count that first one. Like that
Right.
was the zero. That was like the zero one. And then the next one after that was number one. So,
Isn't,
I
isn't that
did
weird?
exit that whole experience. I've written a novel. This is something that I am capable of doing.
Right. Right. And that's a huge distinction, right? Because
Yeah.
it's funny how dismissive you are of a book that you wrote,
Yeah.
which is like 99% of people, like, who dream of writing a book never do it. And then you're just like, I don't
Right.
even count that one because it is a tremendous amount of work, but you do have to have some kind of, it's funny, actually, I have my very first thing that I wrote, which I did get an agent with, but I didn't publish. I never sold. I printed it out and I just literally kind of self bound it for my dad, who was sick at the time. And then my mom just, this is whatever, 20 years ago, my mom just gave this back to me. And I was putting them on bookshop. I looked at a couple pages and I'm like, kind of like, and
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, this is not as bad as I read like one page
Hmm.
and it wasn't great, but it wasn't as bad. So, but I do think we think that we're just terrible. And
Yeah.
how do we advance from there,
It's hard. I mean, I think that you just get the bug at some point. So what ultimately happened with me, the second one I wrote, which is sometimes what I count as the first, as I said, that's what I got an agent with. And in hindsight, I don't think that that book was fully up to what I was capable of, obviously, because, you
Right.
just keep on building and building.
Right.
But it did give me that agent. And at that point, I was more engaged with the notion of finding an audience. And I
Yeah.
think that that was the bug. So I got an agent with this one, did not get a book deal, but there was something to achieve. I could kind of smell the publishing success or
Yeah.
something like.
Right.
And even though I knew there were some things, that the editors were saying that they were definitely right, I was close enough at that point where I could kind of see the finish line. And of course, ultimately, the finish line is just kept on moving out. There's
Right.
always something new to achieve.
Right.
And I think that that is what's kept me going in spite of the fact that, you know, every new one gets me a little bit further, but I never feel like it's the perfect encapsulation of what I'm fully capable of.
Well, even being
So
self,
getting that little taste is
yeah,
is is a nice thing.
but even having that self-awareness to know that you can get better, I think is great for an author to have because I think most don't, right? Most are just
Hmm.
like, eh. And I'm a
That's
firm
who I
believer
am.
on like this is the best of my ability at this point in time.
Hmm.
And, and that's why, you finish a book and like it's not done because you're waiting for your agent to give you comments. You're waiting for your editor to give you comments, all of which are going to make the book better. And it is kind of a group project in a way. But, then you move on to the next thing and and I try not to even think about the old ones that much because you fall in love you fall in love with something new, and whatever you're
That's
working
right.
on is what you love. So when did you so you had the manuscript from college that you didn't count, but that showed you that you had the capability of writing and completing a full novel. And then how then you went out into the world and realized like I need to make money. So you got a job, I assume, and
Yeah.
and then you moved on to keep
I
writing.
work I work in publishing. So
Oh,
like
okay.
my whole life is centered around publishing. It's a little bit excessive actually. But so I mean I'm an editor and I manage teams and stuff like that in a publishing company. Not fiction.
Yeah.
We publish nonfiction, some children's books, some like curriculum.
Which
There's
is
all
great.
kinds
So
of
you're not
publishing.
getting in your mind all screwed up
That's
with your
right.
own stuff.
That's
Because I
right.
could
I'm
see that
not like
happening.
too embedded in one part of publishing.
Right.
Um, I did have to figure out. So, I wrote that first or zero manuscript in school. I eventually had to figure out how to balance writing with a day job,
Hmm.
family life, which everybody has to figure out to a certain extent.
Totally. I did.
Kids,
Yeah.
there's whatever expectations you have on your life. Um, and I think ultimately I started writing seriously. Like it became a regular part of my life when I was 29. And this sounds silly to me in retrospect, but I was 29. And I was like, in a year, I'm going to be 30, and then my life is going to be over.
Right.
So I need to write this book. I need to start writing and get published because if it doesn't happen by the time I'm 30, it's never going to happen.
Oh, wow.
Silly, silly, this is the way that like a 29-year-old thinks, right?
Right.
Um, I'm much older than that now, and life does not end when you're 30. But it was the impetus for me
Yeah.
to really start writing and to develop a writing habit, a writing practice. And that's
Yeah.
ultimately what launched me on this path of getting an agent, struggling with what does the market want? What do I want? How do I reconcile those things?
Right. Right.
Um, and that whole journey, which can take a really long time. Getting an agent is not the end of the journey by any means, as you know.
No, no. And not getting an agent isn't the end of things either.
No, it's not.
It's um but and you can start writing at any age. I think what aspiring writers need to realize is there is a pretty commonly there's a pretty big gap between when you start writing and when something happens.
Yeah.
Because I didn't start writing till I was 33, and my first book didn't publish until I was like 41. So it's
Yeah.
it makes it's a long journey because you do have to go through all of that stuff.
And that's like an extremely normal timeline,
Totally.
the one that you just described. I mean,
Yeah.
I find it really inspiring sometimes when like very established writers will share how many books they wrote before they wrote the book that was their debut.
Right.
Sometimes it's like ten
Totally.
manuscripts. That's a very like average number.
Yeah.
Um, and that can be inspiring or depressing depending on what mood you're in, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my first three didn't sell, and then my fourth sold to a very small publisher that went out of business 6 months after my book came out. So
Oof,
it's not
that
like you
hurts.
sell your debut and like I'm quitting my day job. Uh,
Yeah.
so how did you, going back to what you were saying earlier, how did you crack the code on balancing writing and all other aspects of your life?
Well, it's a code that I'm continuing to crack as my life
Right.
changes.
Yeah.
So initially I cracked it just with in relation to I had a day job and I was married, but there were no children in the picture at that point.
Yeah.
And I did, I think it's good. It was good for me that I developed that skill before there were kids.
Totally.
But then, I do have two kids right now, and when they were newborns, when they were toddlers, anything under the age of 5 is like challenging in a very specific way. I did not
Hmm.
get as much productivity out of those years as I did in the years before
Sure.
children came along.
Sure.
I think what I learned overall is that you really have to look at your life in a very sort of like planful way and figure out how you can fit in writing or even engineer, design the other parts of your life to fit in writing in almost a scientific or like engineering kind of way.
Hmm.
Like the time and the energy is not going to just yield itself up to you. It's not
Right.
just going to come along and say, "Hey, writing time, here I am." It's actually something you have to create.
Right.
So, you could sit down with spreadsheets. You could sit and just order your life. A breakthrough for me was when I heard a writer talk about how he had written his debut while he was like working in finance in New York with two kids under the age of 3. And what he did was there was only one 2-hour block every week in his life where he was totally free. But he sort of like designed everything so that that 2-hour block would be perfect and like very productive. Like he was thinking about his plan up until then. He was arranging things so it felt like very conducive to creativity. And with that 2-hour block once a week, he wrote a debut novel and ended up publishing it.
Yeah.
I thought,
That's
well, if
amazing.
this guy can do it, I think that I can think about all the things that are in my life and I can design, I can, I can, I can design my life so that writing is a priority as
Right.
well. And
Totally.
life continues to change. Kids go through different grade levels. Sometimes you have to take them to soccer or whatever. But at any point, you do have the capability of sitting down and being like, okay, how am I going to fit writing into here? Because I know that if I just like leave it up to chance, it's probably not going to happen.
Right. No, you're 100% right because you have to treat it like a career. Like
Hmm.
even it, so what I learned to do, because I had a full-time gig until a couple of years ago, I just wrote an hour a day. But it's 7 days a week, 365 days a year with a
Hmm.
few exceptions. And then what that teaches you to do, especially when you schedule it, like this debut author did, and you get to that time, and what happens if like I'm not in the mood? And that's where
Yeah,
you learn. I think those are the moments where you learn if you're a writer or not.
right.
Because I think writers don't give a shit about their mood. You go to your day job. There's a lot of times you're not in the mood and you get your stuff done. And I think you write
Right.
enough and it's like, yeah, I've been more inspired at other times, but I got my words in, I can check it off. And I think the consistency is more important than almost anything else because it's just like working out. It's like it's going
Hmm.
to take a
Hmm.
while, but you're going to get addicted to it, and you're going to be fit after a little while, but only if you put the time in and not just when you feel like it, right?
A couple of tricks that have been helpful for me in the consistency piece. I mean, I find that small but consistent amount of small but consistent amounts of work applied over time are way better for me than like a heroic effort every so often,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
1,000 words a day is better than 5,000 words in one
Right.
writing session every week.
Right.
And for me, setting my sights low, but making sure that they happen very often kind of has added to like a positive feedback cycle in my own brain where like if my daily goal of words was 2,000 words, I think I wouldn't make it a lot of the time and
Yeah,
I'd feel
you'd
really
burn
bad
out.
about myself. If my daily goal is more like something like that seems kind of small, like 500 words, I meet that goal a lot and sometimes I exceed it and then I feel really good about myself. And then suddenly the act of writing is associated with positive endorphins rather than like all the negative stuff that floods our brains.
Yeah.
That was kind of like a good thing for me to sort of like short circuit the judgy negative voice that I was having with related to writing in the early days.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And, just to contextualize it for our listeners, yeah, so I still just do an hour a day. And if I'm actively writing a draft, it's kind of more like a 500 word goal. And
Mhm.
that might take 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Might take 15 minutes of sitting there staring since I don't outline. I don't know what's happening next. but that at the draft I just finished took me 5.5 months, and then about another month of editing before I turn it into my agent. So that's pretty fast for only doing an hour a day, and that always seems to amaze people. But I'm like,
Yeah.
it's just math. I mean, and it's writing 500 words is not daunting, and it also gives you the ability to not. I'm a big believer in not forcing the story. Like when you're
Hmm.
just sitting there saying, I'm trying to get 2,000 words in, and now I'm just writing stuff to get the words in rather than writing what's coming out of my subconscious.
Yeah, that's smart.
And so I feel like it makes, for me at least, it makes the story a little bit more pure because I'm not trying to just, get it done in 2 months. That being said, I'm rarely on deadline, so I don't have that pressure. I just make my own deadlines, which is helpful to me. But it's just if you can do it every day, even if it's 15 minutes.
Are you more of a improviser than a planner then, or
Oh
a
yeah,
pantser rather than
I
plotter?
can't. I'm so organized in my life, and then I sit down to write, and I just can't outline. I really recommend people try both ways because
I
you have to
used to.
discover what's natural to you.
Hmm.
Um, and I kind of believe over time what a pantser is really an outliner, and the outline's already complete. They just haven't seen it yet.
Interesting.
For me, it's like you're going through and then you get to a scene like, well, what if this happens? And this major twist that hadn't occurred to you. I think that was there the whole time. I think you just needed to be there for it to reveal itself to you. Whereas
Sure.
outliners go through that process in a more condensed form. What are you?
I'm a little bit more on the outliner side of the spectrum, but I will admit that you discover things along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And what you tend to discover is that if you're an outliner, is that the outline that you've created is actually wrong. Um, and
Hmm.
so I find myself having to be open to both modes because if you stick too closely, I've had books where I've like just held on to that outline, like, like white knuckle holding on to that
Right,
outline.
you're forcing it.
I'm forcing it. And then I will get maybe to a point where I realize I should have let go of the outline and I should have done something different because I made a mistake 25 pages ago, 50 pages ago. And now I'm like,
I'm
it's
not
like,
willing to admit it.
yeah, you can't admit it to yourself. And it's almost like you're on the ocean and you made a wrong navigation. And now you're like 100 or 1,000 miles away from where you're
Right,
supposed to
right,
be.
running out of
So
supplies.
I don't, I think that you kind of have to be open sometimes to switching in both directions. And lately, I've been experimenting a little bit more with sort of not an outline exactly, but having a more loose sense of what's going to happen. I need a little bit of a sense of what's going to happen because otherwise I kind of get paralyzed in the drafting by a lot of questions.
Yeah,
But not having it really be an outline, more having it be like a brainstorm document that I write and then put away.
right.
And then maybe I come back to it if I need it, but I can also depart from it entirely if it's feeling right in the moment,
But
which
you
is
needed to
something
go
I need
through
to
that
do.
exercise of creating that document um, to kind of visualize some loose ideas, right?
Yep.
Because I'm the same way. I have a scrap document that I'm as I kind of thinking about things like maybe this happens or whatever, and then I rarely go back and look at it because it's in my mind,
That's right.
and if it's good, it'll stay there. But with me, it's more of a sense of like you're just winging it, and then like you get a sense of like my character needs to go outside more. My character needs to be physically active more. My character needs to travel somewhere to get information. I just feel like everyone's standing around too much. Those are the little things. Like, there needs to be a conflict coming up here, but it's never. But I'm never like thinking like, oh, every chapter has to end with a cliffhanger. It has
Right.
that formulaic stuff just doesn't work for me because then you get way too preoccupied with the formulas and not letting kind of your soul, come up with stuff. You're not being true to yourself, I think.
I agree. The one thing that I've not had much luck with at all is exactly what you're talking about. So like they'll call it like 7 point plot structure, or like you need a midpoint and and at this point, this is what needs to happen. I find it helpful to kind of be aware of that stuff, like vaguely aware, because I do think that there's something interesting revealed there about how character stakes work or about how conflict works, but I've never been able to like map plot points
Yeah.
that way or map characters into those templates. It's always felt far too constraining for me. But like you, I'll sometimes have a sense like, I think I need this is all starting to feel a little static. There needs to be a twist, or there needs to be something that like reverses the direction of this story. Sometimes you just get a sense of those things, the same way that you get a sense in a sentence of like, it's time to end this sentence, or it's time for a comma, or whatever. It's all about rhythm for me.
Totally, and that's a great point because I'm the same way. I talk about percussion a lot. Like I think different chapters have different levels of percussion to them. Like if you're right, and that can evidence itself in literally how you're typing, how the words and sentences are appearing. If you're in a very tense scene that's just full of fraught things happening, you're just seeing kind of metronomically those sentences being peppered and
Hmm.
they're not
Hmm.
flowing. It's just that percussive like heartbeat. And when you're giving the reader a break, it is more a little bit more flowy, a little bit more maybe more
Hmm.
descriptive. But I think rather than that being something that you're trying to think about, you just get a sense of as you write hundreds of thousands of words. It all boils down to just really putting the time in and learning what doesn't work, what's not registering.
You have to listen to particular music while I mean, the percussive metaphor. Does that help too?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've changed over the years, but I almost always listen now to just thunderstorms.
Sure.
Um, but so I can never listen to anything that has words or lyrics in it because that's
Yeah,
too
neither.
distracting. But sometimes it is just kind of like down tempo electronica
Hmm.
that just kind of has a mood to it. And sometimes I'll get a little corny, and if it's like a really horrible scene, there'll be like, oh, the soundtrack to Stranger Things or like whatever,
Sure.
like
Yeah.
something that's creepy music. It does kind of help. What about you?
I've been back and forth. For a while, I had like a almost a soundtrack for every book.
Yeah, that's great.
And it started to become something that everything is up and down for me. Like every new book teaches me how it wants to be written on some level.
Right,
And I think that the I was getting a little bit too focused on like I need the right music for this scene or whatever. And it became another distraction or another like excuse for myself about like why something wasn't working or why I had to put it down and start over again later. Like,
right,
oh, I need to find the perfect music for this book or for this character. And ultimately it was like just shut up and write. Like you
right,
don't need the perfect music. The
right,
conditions don't need to be perfect. Like
right,
you need to just be able to write. And so
yeah,
white noise, silence, like whatever.
right,
I'm at this point, I'm just committing to you got to write.
right. Because you've built the muscle where you don't need the training wheels.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
now was the Temps, was that your debut?
It was not my debut. So before that, I had a YA novel with a really small company that went out of business. And it was a YA science fiction novel.
Hmm,
It sold barely anything. The Temps, I think, probably most people regard as my debut because it was the only one that really, it was the first that really kind of appeared in the world in any meaningful way.
right.
And I do love that book a lot. I mean, in part, I think that the cover sticks in people's minds because
Totally.
if you've seen it, it is very, very colorful. It's
and
like
and
neon
apocalyptic.
green, pink, yellow. It's like someone made it with highlighter, only
Yeah,
with like highlighter
totally.
colors, right? And that book was published with a smaller publisher, but it's done modestly okay. And it actually got so it's about, and that's science fiction, speculative fiction as well. I've since moved into a more like thriller crime
Right.
direction. But this was about a group of temp workers at a big corporate center who there's a global apocalypse that happens outside and they're stuck at work. So it's kind of like Dawn of the Dead, but if instead of they're stuck in a mall, they're stuck at
Meets the
like
office. Yeah.
meets the office. Dawn of the Dead meets the office, exactly, or Office Space
I
or
love
something.
it.
And it was a lot of fun to write. It got optioned for TV,
Oh, that's
and
great.
that's something that like just kind of happens in the background.
Right.
Will it ever become a TV show? Generally speaking, even when things get optioned, the answer is no. So, it'd
Totally.
be
Yeah.
delightful if it did happen, but like that's a thing that happened in my
You don't
life.
think about it. Right.
You don't think about it. You put it to the side and you're like, if anything happens, that'd be really nice.
Yeah.
And then after that was The Day He Never Came Home, which came out last year with Poison Pen, our shared and
Yeah.
wonderful publisher. They're so great to work with.
Yeah. And
Just
so,
such
right. And
work
so
in this space.
like you said, you shifted then kind of into crime, thriller, suspense, and then your agent knew enough to reach out to
Yeah.
Source Books. Yeah. When I first started with Source Books, they didn't even have Poison Pen Press yet. So yeah, this is my sixth book with them, but
That's
yeah,
great.
and I've seen them grow and I mean, they've been around for a long time, but they're really a substantial house now.
They're fantastic. I mean, I like working with them so much, and they really seem to commit to writers uh, for multiple books, which I think is exactly what you need to do in this space. Like,
Yeah.
um, because you never know what's going to break out, and then people who discover one, they're like, now I want everything that Carter Wilson has ever written. Like, why wouldn't it be the way it works? So
Yeah.
I really enjoy working with them.
Yeah. They've been great. And I forget who is Anna your editor or
So I've
Stan?
actually worked with Deb, who is one of the original employees, I think, of Sourcebooks in general.
Hmm.
And she crosses imprints.
Got
So
it.
I think Anna is mostly focused in Poison Pen, but Deb
Yeah.
kind of like does it all.
Oh, okay, fantastic. But yeah, I have a little context just because I had been with the three other publishers before Source Books, to know like which ones are going to give heady PR and marketing support,
Yep.
which
Yep.
one of them are going to give great notes as opposed to, and which ones are going to just give you attention, because you do hear stories even at the big five wherever of like
Yep.
if you're a small fish, like you might just be totally ignored, and it's like, well, why did they acquire my book?
Why'd they bother?
But
Yeah.
that's the business of it. So you want to be with somebody who's passionate about your work, and even if it's just one person who happened to like read it and love it and wants to acquire it, that's what it takes, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
So did they? So when you went with The Day He Never Came Home, was that then already a two-book deal?
That was a two-book deal.
That's great.
And so the book that's coming out in this July, Stay Away from Him, is the second book on that deal. Had a
But
great experience
it's a
with the day
series or
he,
standalones?
it's a standalone. You
Yeah.
do standalones mostly too,
I
right?
only do standalones, but
Yeah,
and it's more rare than not that you can get a multi-book deal with standalones.
standalones. That's interesting. I'm always waiting for my agent to tell me like, enough with these standalones. It's time to do a series or something like that. But I guess you just see what people want and where you're pushed.
But I
I
think
mean,
it's also like because I remember having, it's funny, I had a conversation with my editor a few years ago, just when I was in a place in my writing life where I was just questioning everything. And
mhm.
and I feel like, with your editor and with your publisher, it's not like we talk to them a lot, or at least not that I do. Like you talk when you need to talk.
They're
Most of the
busy.
stuff is most of the stuff
Yeah.
is handled over email. Everything gets accomplished what needs to get accomplished, but it's not. So what actually I did, you're gonna laugh at this. I emailed my editor a few years ago, and I'm like, "Can I have an employee review?" I'm like, because if I were in a corporate job every year, you would tell me what you like and what you don't like, but I have no idea. I have no idea what you think about when you think about my future. If you think about my future, like,
That's really smart.
and so I just reached out, and it was great. It was a great, very raw, like in a good way, conversation. And I remember asking her, I'm like, what do you think about me writing a series? And her answer was, I don't think you would like that. And I'm like, that's a really interesting answer because I think you're probably right. I probably wouldn't like that, but
Yeah.
like the fact that it was important that it mattered to me and not to the business I thought was pretty cool.
Well, and we are in crime, thriller, mystery. That's the genre that you and I write in. There's subgenres there as well. And, if you want a series, I feel like what you generally need to do in this space is pick a cop or a private eye or
Right.
an FBI agent or something like that. And right now, I'm just more interested in stories of like regular people whose
Totally.
lives bump up against crime and danger and stuff like that. And it's very difficult to turn that
Right.
kind of a character
How
into
much
a
shit can
literary
happen to
series.
this one person, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like the Die Hard series at that point. Like how much stuff can happen to this one guy? It's
Right,
ridiculous.
right.
Yeah.
I'm 100% the same way because that's exactly what I write. Like I crime adjacent people,
Yeah.
um, who aren't necessarily specialized in anything,
Hmm.
and because then you write it and you're allowed to continuously ask yourself, well, what would I do here? What would I
Yep.
do here? And then you just add 50 to 70% more bravery, and it becomes an interesting story. I think.
More than that for me. The numbers have to be higher for bravery. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, but writing a series has never really totally appealed to me. And that, but you don't cut off that possibility. So I have a lot of crossovers where characters will kind of come in and out of different books that were in other books, but it doesn't matter who they are. Or somebody
I
might
like
put on
that.
a sweatshirt for a fake university that a character 8 books ago went to. Nobody's going to get that. It just amuses me to put stuff like that in there. So that's how I write series basically.
Someone's going to notice someday, right? You're
Yeah,
building an extended universe. You're building the Carter Wilson universe. It's
right.
great.
But it's fun. And so then you have your next book coming out. So obviously at this point in time, it's done. Arcs are coming out
Yep.
very soon. I assume you're getting blurbs, which is always
Yeah, a
scary
little
slash
harrowing. Yeah.
would you I'm very generous giving blurbs because I was always so like I couldn't believe anybody would read my book and like blurb it. That just
I
seemed
know.
like unbelievable. I remember asking Alan Askins, speaking of
Oh yeah,
Minnesota.
Minnesota guy.
Yeah, at one point early on in my career, we'd make a list of people we were going to target, and then I would make videos for each one of them
Whoa.
of me
Wow.
kind of just saying, "Hey, you don't know me." Um, and I remember I was talking to Alan at a conference. He's like, "I was about to reject your request, and then I saw the fucking video, and I felt bad." So I'm
Amazing.
like,
You're like,
"Oh,
this guy went to the trouble. He really deserves it. Yeah.
right, right," because it is. It's hard. It's a struggle. I mean, no matter where you are on the food chain, like it's asking people. It's a big ask, I think.
It is a big ask. And so much of the things that you're asked to do as an author in the sort of like self-promotion and asking for favors thing, it's just good to acknowledge that it's embarrassing. Like asking everybody you know to pre-order a book just is like a little embarrassing.
100%.
Asking someone that you don't know or that you sort of casually know, please, will you blurb my book? Like it's embarrassing. And I think even aside from just being vulnerable, and once I was able to acknowledge that, it actually made it a little bit easier to do it. Like I'm just gonna do this is gonna be embarrassing and I'm just gonna do it.
Right. Totally. And I think what you also learn is how, in my experience at least, and certainly in the mystery crime suspense realm, how selfless authors are and how
100%.
approachable they are. And yeah, of course you're going to get a lot of no's, but they're all cool. I mean, I'm stunned. It's funny. I
Not
remember
personal,
like
right? The no's are not even personal. It's just like I'm
never
really
personal.
busy or whatever. Yeah.
Never personal. The only and I say no every now and then. My restriction is like if somebody's like, "Hey, can I get this in 3 weeks?" And I'm like,
Too
"No,"
fast.
because I read the book. I don't just make up something.
That's right.
Because what if it's terrible?
Yeah.
You never know what it's going to be. But like, so Lisa Gardner is a good example of somebody who I didn't ask even, and I know her just a little bit. I've interviewed her on this, and I asked her to interview me for this Barnes and Noble thing, and she couldn't. But she just happened to say, "But hey, if you have a digital copy of your book, I'd love to see it." And then like a week
Wow.
later, she emails me. She's like, I love this. How can I help you? And I'm like, a blurb would be great. And
Thank you,
I'm
Lisa.
like, and
Yeah.
so I didn't even ask her, and that was so selfless of her.
Mhm.
And I bring it up because that's most authors I find are like that. They're just like, hey man, send me a graphic, and I will support your book when it launches. Just remind me, like it's just really great because there's no sense of like, you're only going to you have to choose between Carter's book and Andrew's book. No, they're all going to buy the books.
We can all succeed. I think it's great. Yeah, and writers are among the most generous people that I've met. It's very rare to find one who's like too big time to talk to someone who's just starting out or a mid-list author.
Totally.
Folks are really generous. People have limited time, but
Right.
there's nothing personal in that.
Right.
Um,
Right.
they can either do it or they can't.
There's nothing Machiavellian about the whole thing. And I feel like the publishing, I mean, my experience in the publishing industry certainly is like you're not in this environment, where you think of the stereotypical corporate environment where everyone's trying to like figure out how they can backstab you so they can
Mhm.
advance over your trampled body. In in a publisher, it's like they all have the same goal to sell as many copies of this book
Sell
as
books.
possible.
Yeah,
So why would they try to do something to sabotage that?
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so it's been great. Well, Andrew, I know we're running out of time, but we do have one part of the show that's left before you have to get back to work, which is the storytelling part of the show, the making it up part of the show, where I've chosen three books kind of at random, all from the same shelf, from my bookshelf. You're going to choose one of those. We're going to pick a random sentence from a random page, and I'm going to read that sentence, and that'll be the first sentence in like a 2-minute long short story. So I'm going to
Okay.
read that sentence, and then you give me the next sentence or two, whatever comes to your head happens. Then I'll do a sentence or two, and then when it goes completely off the rails, or when it becomes so compelling that we can't go any further with it, I'll call it a day. So I've got some what you would consider literary titles here.
Oh, hey.
Um,
Yeah.
so I've got Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian
Wow.
for you English major. David Mitchell's Slade House, kind of hard to see,
Yeah.
and Slaughterhouse-Five.
Oh boy.
So give me
Let's
one of those.
do Slaughterhouse-Five actually.
Good. I was hoping you weren't going to say Cormac McCarthy because it's like who knows what kind of sentence we were going to get.
I know. I might not even understand some of the words in
I
the sentence.
know. So give me a number between 1 and 275.
173.
Okay, so this is the first page of chapter 6. We okay. This is actually two sentences, but I'm going to put a comma in my head between them, and you do whatever you want with this. Billy sat up in bed. He had no idea what year it was or what planet he was on.
So I provide the next sentence,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, or two or whatever.
So he had no idea what year it was or what planet he was on.
Hmm.
Um, a a boulder fell through the roof. I don't know. Can we be silly? Can we
Do
be like
whatever you want, and
absurd as possible? All right.
yeah. So a boulder fell through the roof.
Yeah.
At first, he thought it was just his raging hangover, but then he blinked, checked again, and realized, holy shit, that is an actual boulder. It had crashed through the bathroom, smashed through the plumbing, and water sprayed all the way into the bedroom as he just blankly stared in the distance.
I went through the bathroom. He got up and went to the bathroom to examine the boulder more closely. As he looked at it, he noticed something glowing, a green glow inside the boulder.
The benefit was he had no longer had any survival instincts, feeling still confused about not knowing even where he was. So, feeling all in, he reached forward and touched the green glow, which turned out to be a very sticky substance.
Oh boy, this is getting a little X-Files. With the substance on his hand, he left the bathroom and went to the kitchen and got a container from the drawer, and he smeared the substance into the container, sealed the top, and then picked up the phone.
It was dead, just as he expected. But in his distraction, he had forgotten to do the one thing he had already reminded himself 3 times to do in the last 20 seconds, which was to wash that hand. And since he didn't, he felt a sudden tingling sensation that turned into a burning sensation that became, at length, undeniably searing.
Panicking, and with the phone entirely dead, he could not call 911. This is a bad sentence, but he ran out the front door, whereupon he discovered that several military vehicles had rolled up on the street, and folks in hazmat suits were running quickly toward him.
Oh, I think we call it there. See, what a great setup. I would watch that episode of The X-Files.
I would too. At that point, Mulder and Scully get called in.
Right.
Yeah.
Or they're briefed on, they found a body that was covered in a green slime that was still smoking.
That's right. Yeah. Just like,
hey, buddy, it was a pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad you made some time for me today. And thank you also for, I know we rearranged the time, so I appreciate that. But it's great hearing about your journey, and I'm excited for your upcoming book and seeing what you do next.
Thank you. Well, continued congratulations on your book. Love to see it going so far.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. I'm sure we'll talk soon. All right, friends, that is it. That is my conversation with Andrew DeYoung. Just a reminder, his upcoming book out this summer from Poison Pen Press is called Stay Away From Him, and was released last year, was The Day He Never Came Home. So please check those out, and you can see more about Andrew at his website, which is just andrewdeyoung.com, and you can head on over to carterwilson.com if you're interested in any of my books, and you can subscribe to my newsletter, read my blog, check out other episodes of Making It Up, all that good stuff. And you can pop on over to unboundwriter.com if you're interested in any kind of coaching or writerly advice. Okay, that is it for this episode of Making It Up. I hope you enjoyed it. Another episode out just next week. In the meantime, take care.